What kind of father banishes his own son just for asking that his grandchildren be given a future? This wasn't a cold political maneuver. This wasn't just another royal feud buried under centuries of pomp and protocol. No, this was something darker, more personal, a rejection that cut deeper than any royal statement or media leak. Because behind the palace gates, where smiles are staged and silence is currency, King Charles made a decision that shocked even the tight-lipped courtiers who've seen it all. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. He didn't just say no. He slammed the door. And then, he turned the lock. What triggered it? Just one request. A private appeal from Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, asking the royal family to support their children, Archie and Lilibet, by contributing to their education. That's it. No public plea. No explosive interview. Just a family asking for help with two innocent children at the center. But what they got in return? Banishment. A move so final, so emotionally ruthless, that even hardened royal insiders were left speechless. Not because it was dramatic, but because of how calculated it was. So the question is, why now? Why did King Charles choose this moment, this request, this line in the sand? Because when it comes to the royal family, nothing is ever just about money. It's about power, control, reputation, and above all, survival. Let's go deeper. Let's peel back the royal polish and see what's festering underneath. Because this isn't just a family falling apart. It's a monarchy actively disowning its own bloodline. And the public? They've only seen the surface. Until now. Rewind with me. It was supposed to be a fresh chapter. After the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, there was hope. Fragile, yes, but real. That maybe, just maybe, the family could find a way back together. Harry was back in the UK. Meghan played it low-key. William and Harry stood together at events, albeit stiffly. The Queen was gone, and with her, the final thread holding the fractured House of Windsor together. Charles ascended the throne. A new era. A clean slate? Not even close. Because almost immediately, Harry and Meghan's very existence became a ticking time bomb. They weren't just family. They were former working royals. They were also media powerhouses with contracts, documentaries, memoirs, and a global following. They were also parents. Parents raising two children, Archie and Lilibet, who, like it or not, carry royal blood. And those children? They are legally prince and princess. Yes, let's not forget. Charles didn't strip them of their titles when he became king. He could have, but he didn't. Why? Because doing so would have sparked backlash. And Charles, ever the master of cautious optics, knew that would be political suicide. Instead, he waited, watched, until Harry and Meghan, perhaps naively, made what they thought was a simple, reasonable ask. Help us fund our children's education. It wasn't even an outrageous demand. It was framed, according to insider sources, as a family discussion, something that could be handled discreetly. But Charles didn't see it that way. He saw it as manipulation. Because in his eyes, Harry and Meghan had already chosen exile, chosen independence, chosen Netflix, chosen to air family secrets to the world. So why should the monarchy, the very institution they left behind, now foot the bill for their children? Even if those children carry royal titles? Even if those children are still, technically, in the line of succession? Charles saw only one option. Shut it down. With finality. The message came not in a phone call, but in writing. Delivered, reportedly, through official channels. It wasn't just a no. It was a rejection so sharp, so emotionless, that even royal aides flinched reading it. And that's where the story begins to twist. Because this wasn't just a private denial. Within days, perhaps even hours, whispers started leaking. Into the press. Into courtier conversations. Into royal sources on background. Suddenly, the public knew. Not all the details, but enough. Enough to paint a picture of Harry and Meghan once again begging for handouts, and Charles being the firm, reasonable monarch saying no. But is that what really happened? Or was the truth more tragic? Let's remember, we're talking about children. About Archie and Lilibet, two young kids who didn't choose any of this. Born into chaos, into fame, into controversy. They didn't choose to be born across the ocean from Buckingham Palace. They didn't choose the Netflix deals, the Oprah interviews, the accusations, the palace politics. They're just kids. And their parents made one request: help us give them the best education possible. Not because they couldn't afford it. Meghan and Harry certainly have money, but because they believed the royal family had a responsibility, a legacy to uphold, a duty of care. But instead, they were cut off. Not just financially, emotionally. Sources say King Charles didn't even write the reply himself. He had aides handle it. A formal dismissal, citing the Sussexes' choice to distance themselves from royal obligations as justification for declining the request. No warmth, no understanding, just bureaucracy, just business. And here's where things get darker. Because this wasn't just about saying no. It was about making a point. Charles wanted it known, within the family and beyond, that the Sussexes no longer had any claim to royal resources, not even for their children. That message wasn't just for Harry and Meghan. It was for William. It was for the press. It was for the Commonwealth. It was Charles's way of saying, I am king now, and the line ends where I say it ends. But did it have to be this way? That's the question echoing through the royal halls and across social media. Some say Charles was justified, that Harry and Meghan made their bed, and now they must lie in it. Others say it was heartless, that no matter the past, children shouldn't be punished for their parents' choices. But here's the twist most people didn't see coming. Charles had quietly offered financial support to other extended family members before. Cousins, nephews, even those with no public role. So why the iron fist with Harry's children? Because this wasn't about precedent. This was about punishment. Charles was drawing a red line. Not in the sand, in ink. A line that told Harry, you are no longer welcome here. And your children? They're not our problem anymore. Imagine being Harry, reading that, feeling that, knowing your father, the man who walked you behind your mother's coffin, has now denied your own children even the smallest connection to their heritage. And what about Meghan? This wasn't just a denial. This was humiliation. A calculated royal move designed to put them in their place, and do so publicly, without ever issuing a formal statement. They were frozen out. And that's when the real war began. Because Meghan wasn't about to stay silent. And Harry? He picked up the phone. But what happened during that call would shake the monarchy to its core. And when William found out, the drama exploded into something no one, not even the Queen, had she lived, could have stopped. Have you ever heard a silence so loud, it breaks you? That was the sound on the other end of the line when Harry finally spoke to his father. Because let's be clear, this wasn't just any phone call. This was years of hurt, betrayal, and abandonment, all boiling beneath a single conversation. And yet, Harry still hoped, still thought. Maybe, just maybe, the man who once carried him on his shoulders, who comforted him through Diana's death, would show a flicker of warmth, a crack in the crown. But what he got was ice. According to insiders, the call lasted less than 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Not even enough time for Harry to finish what he came to say before Charles, reportedly, cut him off. And what Charles said, allegedly, was devastating. You made your choice. We all have to live with ours. No compromise. No offer to talk it through. No emotion. Just protocol. Just distance. Just dismissal. And the part that truly shook Harry? The fact that Charles didn't even ask about the kids. Not once. Not a how are Archie and Lily adjusting. Not even a how's school. That silence wasn't just loud. It was deafening. So Harry did what anyone in that kind of emotional tailspin might do. He lashed out. Not in public. Not yet. But behind closed doors, he raged. Furious. Heartbroken. Humiliated. Because no matter how much you try to convince the world you've moved on, no one's immune to the pain of a parent shutting the door on you and your children. And here's where it gets even more twisted. Within hours of that call, Charles allegedly briefed William, not just as his son, but as his heir. This wasn't a personal matter anymore. It was a matter of royal optics, a question of precedent, of future expectations. Because if Charles gave in to Harry's request, even once, what message would that send? To the press? To the British public? To the other royals waiting for a slice of the sovereign grant? William reportedly didn't just agree with Charles. He pushed harder, urged him to be firm, final, ruthless, even. He saw this as a test, a trap. If they gave the Sussexes an inch, the next ask could be bigger. And let's be honest, William has long since stopped seeing Harry as the spare. He sees him now as a threat, an unpredictable wild card with a platform. And a grudge. So when Charles told him about the call, William allegedly didn't hesitate. "You were right to say no," he said. "They'll only come back for more." But what neither of them expected was Meghan's response. While Harry was spiraling from that cold phone call, Meghan was already drafting, plotting. Some say it was a press release. Others say it was a personal statement. Still others whisper it was a legal document. What's clear is this: she wasn't about to let the palace control the narrative again. Not after everything they'd already survived: the racism, the security threats, the character assassination. Not after they'd built their own brand, their own following, their own fortune, only to be treated like discarded staff when it came to their own kids. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about dignity. So Meghan, reportedly, began assembling her inner circle, her team, her allies, her media strategists. And the plan? Flip the story. From entitled ex-royals begging for money to two parents asking the monarchy to acknowledge their biracial grandchildren and being stonewalled. Think about that for a second. In a world still grappling with institutional racism, with privilege and power and perception, that narrative hits hard, hits deep, and the palace knew it. Because behind the walls of Buckingham, aides scrambled, not to respond publicly. Oh no, that would validate the story. But to contain it, to manage the optics. Because the last thing Charles wanted, as a newly minted king, was a full-blown PR war with his own son, again. Especially one that centered on race. Especially one that put Archie and Lilibet front and center in a debate about royal inheritance and inclusion. But it was already too late. Because the story was moving. And once a story starts moving, you can't control where it lands. So how did it leak? Who tipped off the press? That's the million-pound question. Some blame Meghan's team. Others suspect a rogue palace aide trying to stir the pot. But here's the truth. Both sides had something to gain from the leak. For Meghan and Harry, it was sympathy, momentum, a chance to reclaim the moral high ground. For the palace, a warning, a message to any other disgruntled royal in-laws. The crown does not negotiate. And as the headlines hit, King Charles denies education request. Harry's children, not the crown's problem. Palace severs last link to Archie and Lilibet. The public began to take sides. The war lines were drawn. And the battle was just beginning. What's fascinating is how fast the mood shifted. At first, British tabloids mocked the Sussexes, called them entitled, manipulative, greedy. But as more details emerged about the children, the tone of Charles's letter, the coldness of the call, the public started asking different questions. Why punish the kids? Is this about money or something deeper? Would Diana have ever allowed this? And there it is, Diana. Her name always floats into the room when it gets this bad. Because no matter how many years pass, her shadow looms over every family decision, every media storm, every royal scandal. And this reeked of déjà vu. A once-loved royal spouse turned pariah, a parent pleading for compassion, and a system that turned its back. The comparisons were too strong to ignore, and the whispers began to swell. If Diana were alive, she'd be horrified. She'd never let Charles shut the door on those kids. She'd remind them all what really matters, family. But the past can't speak. Only the present can scream. And Meghan? She was ready to scream, but this time, strategically. Because while Charles was busy protecting his crown, Meghan was preparing to protect her children's legacy. And what she did next wasn't a press interview, wasn't an Instagram post, wasn't even a Netflix teaser. It was something far more calculated. A move that reframed the entire story and turned the monarchy's cold rejection into a global rallying cry. A move so unexpected, so dramatic, it forced Charles, William, and the entire royal machine to reevaluate the cost of their silence. Because Meghan was done asking nicely. And when Harry found out what she was planning, even he was stunned. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. They thought it would stay private. A quiet letter. A respectful ask. No media storm. No leaks. Just a simple family matter. That's how it started. But within days, it was war. Because what Harry and Meghan thought was a personal plea, a direct request to King Charles to support the education of Archie and Lilibet, exploded into a public spectacle. And the worst part? It didn't need to happen. Or did it? Let's rewind. Let's go back to the moment that set this entire royal firestorm ablaze. It was sometime in late September, quiet in the royal world. The Queen had passed a year prior. The coronation dust had settled. The palace was finally breathing again, focused on slimming down, projecting stability, and distancing itself from the chaos of Megxit. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan were rebuilding. Monte Carlo business summits, red carpet appearances, new foundation plans, whispers of a rebrand, less royal, more global philanthropy. They were staying out of trouble mostly. But in the background, one issue kept resurfacing, one that wouldn't go away. Their children. More specifically, their children's future. Archie was getting older, school was approaching, and Lilibet wasn't far behind. For any parent, this is the moment decisions become real. Where to enroll them, how to raise them, British or American. And deeper still, would they grow up with any connection to their heritage? That's when the discussion reportedly began between Harry and Meghan. Should they ask the royal family for support? Not for luxuries, not for titles, but for education. Because despite their own wealth, the Sussexes believed that Archie and Lilibet, as prince and princess, were still tied to the institution, still heirs to a legacy, still deserving of the same treatment their royal cousins received. And that treatment included trust funds, private tutors, elite institutions like Eton or St. George's, or even bespoke programs abroad, curated for the royal elite. So Meghan encouraged Harry to reach out, not to grovel, not to beg, but to open a door. Make it about the kids, she allegedly told him. Let's try, one last time, to do this as family. So Harry did. He penned a letter, hand-delivered, according to sources, by a trusted intermediary. Not an aide, not a lawyer, someone close, someone who still had access to the palace inner circle. The letter was short, formal, but heartfelt. It expressed the desire for Archie and Lilibet to be given the same consideration as other royal children in terms of educational support, even if they lived overseas. It referenced legacy, bloodlines, and yes, forgiveness. It wasn't demanding. It wasn't threatening. It was, for once, gentle. Harry believed it would be received in the same spirit. But what came back was cold, brutal, final. Before we get to that response, let's ask the question directly. Why would Harry and Meghan even need help with education? Aren't they multimillionaires? Absolutely. But this wasn't about affordability. It was about principle and perception, because Harry wasn't just thinking about private school tuition. He was thinking long-term, generational identity, public legitimacy. Think about it. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis will all attend the finest institutions, funded in part by the royal family's private wealth and publicly supported expenses. It's not just about books and uniforms. It's about belonging. It's about symbolism. And for Harry, who's always struggled with being the spare, he didn't want that same shadow following his children. So this request? It wasn't about the money. It was about equality, recognition, continuity. But Charles saw it differently. When the reply came, it wasn't signed by the king directly. That in itself was telling. It came through Sir Clive Alderton, Charles's private secretary, though some believe Charles dictated the tone. It was just 2 paragraphs long, polite but firm, acknowledging Harry's concerns, but declining to entertain requests for institutional support from non-working members of the royal family. Translation? You left. You're out. Don't come knocking now. But that wasn't all. Buried in the final line was a statement that made Harry's blood boil. We trust you and your wife will make the appropriate arrangements as private citizens. Private citizens. After everything. After the sacrifice. The headlines. The security battles. The death threats. After being born into the most visible family in the world. They were now being told, you're just like everyone else. No title protections. No trust fund top-ups. No acknowledgement of heritage. Just private citizens. Harry was livid. Meghan? Shocked. And here's the real kicker. Insiders claim Meghan didn't believe Charles would actually say no. She thought the optics alone, publicly denying support for biracial royal children, would be too radioactive for the monarchy. But Charles didn't care. Because this wasn't about fairness. It was about setting a precedent. A line in the sand. Charles, according to palace sources, was determined to cut all remaining financial ties to the Sussexes, not just as punishment, but as policy. If Harry and Meghan were allowed to dip into royal funds, just for the kids. What's to stop them from asking for security next? Or a house? Or taxpayer support? And Charles, now king, had a vision, a slimmed-down monarchy. Tight, clean, contained. No wild cards. No exiles pulling at the purse strings from abroad. So he drew the line. And in doing so, he made a statement far louder than any tabloid headline. Archie and Lilibet may carry titles, but they carry no weight here. Here's where things got strategic. Because while Charles thought he was closing the door quietly, the media had already sniffed it out. Leaks, whispers, confirmations from sources close to the palace. And just like that, the private letter became public ammunition. Headlines erupted. King rejects Harry's education request. Charles cuts off royal grandchildren. Palace tells Sussexes, "You're on your own." And the timing? Brutal. Because that same week, Prince George was photographed arriving at Lambrook School in a luxury convoy, smiling beside Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis. All three fully funded, protected, and paraded. The contrast? Devastating. For Meghan, this was humiliation. For Harry, it was betrayal. And for the children, it was a signal, clear as day, you are not part of this family anymore. But here's what no one saw coming. Meghan's pivot. Because while the palace thought they had buried the story, she was just getting started. Not with an interview, not with an angry tweet, but with something far more subtle and far more dangerous. A call, not to the press, not to Oprah, but to her former allies at Soho House, the private club where it all began. And what she planned next would turn this family feud into a global firestorm. Because Meghan was done asking. She was ready to expose. And the first step wasn't revenge. It was revelation. But more on that in phase 2. How far would you go to prove you've moved on? Would you slam the door, even if your grandchildren were standing on the other side? Because that's exactly what King Charles did. But this wasn't just a rejection. It was something far colder. Banishment. And not in the fairy tale sense. No carriages, no scrolls, no thunderous pronouncement from the palace balcony. No, this was a modern monarchy. And the exile came in the form of a one-page memo, deliberately cold, deliberately final, and devastatingly calculated. Let's be clear, Charles didn't have to respond the way he did. He chose to, and that choice would send shockwaves through not just the royal family, but across the world. The memo was short, clipped, just enough words to close the door and slam it. According to royal insiders, the letter came through official palace channels. No calls, no warmth, not even a personal signature. And within it, one phrase stood out like a slap in the face. The matter is closed. 6 words. That's all. But those 6 words didn't just deny a request. They drew a line through an entire branch of the royal family. Because behind the formality was a message far louder. Don't come back. Not for money. Not for recognition. Not even for your children. Especially not for your children. So why did Charles respond with such ruthless finality? Was it bitterness? A bruised ego? Or was this the ultimate political move by a man who's spent his entire life waiting to be king? Let's break it down. Charles, now sovereign, is walking a royal tightrope. On one hand, he's tasked with modernizing the monarchy, slimming it down, cutting costs, making it fit for the 21st century. On the other hand, he's got a rebellious son living in California, launching docuseries, writing memoirs, and calling out the firm by name. How do you maintain control of the crown when your son is torching its foundations from a podcast studio in Montecito? You send a message, not to the public, not even to Harry, but to everyone else. The courtiers, the extended family, the British press, the Commonwealth. You let them know, I am the king. I will not be leveraged. And in Charles's eyes, this request, even if it came quietly, privately, wasn't just about education. It was about power. Because if Harry and Meghan succeeded in getting royal support for their children's future, what came next? A request for security? A home in Windsor? Reintegration? No. Charles needed to cut the cord. And that's what this letter did. It didn't just reject the request. It redefined the relationship, not as family, but as outsiders. But here's where things get even darker. Because inside the palace, the language of the memo was no accident. It wasn't rushed. It was crafted. Words like non-working royals. Phrases like independent family units. It was legalistic, bureaucratic, impersonal, deliberately so. Because Charles didn't just want to say no, he wanted a paper trail. Evidence. Proof that the crown had done its duty, and nothing more. It was a firewall. And behind that firewall, Harry, Meghan, Archie, and Lilibet, now fully and officially on their own. Now ask yourself this. What kind of grandfather chooses protocol over blood? What kind of monarch refuses to fund the future of his own lineage? Because Archie and Lilibet aren't distant cousins. They're his grandchildren, children of his son, children of Diana's son, children who will grow up reading headlines that they were denied support by their royal family, while their cousins were chauffeured in Range Rovers to elite schools and dressed in uniforms tailored by Savile Row. It's not just painful, it's cruel, and that cruelty wasn't lost on Meghan. Reports suggest that when Meghan read the letter, she didn't cry, she didn't shout, she sat in silence for nearly 2 hours. And then, she made a single call, not to Harry, not to her agent, not to Netflix, to her mother, Doria. Sources close to the Sussexes say the conversation was brief, but revealing. Meghan reportedly said, "He didn't just say no to us. He said no to our babies." And that was the turning point. Because up until that moment, there was still a part of Meghan that believed they could find middle ground. That somewhere beneath the tradition and tension, there was still family. But after that letter, that illusion was dead. And what replaced it? Resolve. But before Meghan could act, something else happened. Something she didn't expect. William called Harry. Now pause there. Let that sink in. William, who hadn't spoken to Harry in weeks, suddenly picks up the phone. Not to apologize. Not to mediate. But to reinforce the message. To make it clear that the decision was mutual. Unified. Palace approved. Insider sources say the call lasted less than 6 minutes. William reportedly told Harry, "You made your bed. Now lie in it." Brutal, but very on brand. Because William, who spent the last 3 years rebuilding his image as the steady, reliable, future king, isn't just about diplomacy. He's about optics. And to him, Harry and Meghan's request wasn't just bold. It was dangerous, because it cracked open the door to reintegration. Something William has fought tooth and nail to avoid. So William didn't just back Charles's rejection. He doubled down. And with that call, he burned the bridge. Now here's where it gets especially heartbreaking. Because that same week, the week the memo was delivered, the week the call happened, was Archie's birthday. And guess who didn't call? Charles, William, even Kate, who reportedly sent a generic message through a private aide, kept her distance. There was no Zoom, no video chat, no card with a royal crest. Nothing. Just silence. Deliberate silence. It was the kind of emotional punishment that only the royal family can deliver. Polite, quiet, devastating. And Meghan? She took it personally. Because while Harry still held on to hope that one day things might heal, Meghan finally realized something. They don't want us back. Not for tea. Not for trooping the color. Not even for Christmas. And certainly not for the education of Archie and Lilibet. They were done. And now? So was she. But what came next wasn't rage. It was planning. Because Meghan knew something the palace didn't. They'd made a fatal mistake. They had turned a request into a rejection into a message. And that message could now be weaponized. Not through scandal, not through interviews, but through strategy. Because when a powerful institution shows the world it will cut off its own, the world starts paying attention. Sympathy shifts. Narratives change. And that's exactly what Meghan intended to do. But how? That's what Charles never saw coming. Because Meghan's next move wasn't to the press. It was to the public. And the way she planned to do it would flip the entire story upside down. What happens when the woman who married a prince finally realizes the fairy tale is dead? When the castle doors are locked and her children are left out in the cold? She doesn't cry. Not at first. She strategizes. Then she crumbles, but not where anyone can see it. And finally, she rises. And that's exactly what Meghan Markle did. But not before everything inside her cracked. Because the moment the rejection came, the rage began to boil. Not just at Charles. Not just at William. But at the entire monarchy. At the world that told her to know her place. To smile pretty and stay quiet. To move on, while her children's titles were weaponized. Their futures debated like policy points on a spreadsheet. But this time, she wasn't staying quiet. She had a statement to make. And the first draft would be written in fire. Let's start at ground zero. The day Meghan learned that Archie and Lilibet's educational request had been denied. It was a quiet morning in Montecito. A weekday. Normal. Almost peaceful. The kids were playing in the backyard. Harry was in his office. Meghan was checking emails in the kitchen. Then the message came through, a short email from their legal liaison in the UK. Subject line, official response from Clarence House, education inquiry. Meghan clicked it open, and everything changed. The color drained from her face. She didn't scream. She didn't move. She just stared. And then, she laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. After everything this was their answer? A cold rejection. A bureaucratic slap. A thinly veiled insult dressed up in formal language. It wasn't just a no. It was a reminder. They don't want you. They never did. They tolerated you when it was convenient. Paraded you when it was profitable. But love? Acceptance? That was never part of the contract. And now, they're coming for your kids, too. Harry walked in moments later. Everything okay? He asked, holding a mug of tea. She didn't answer. She handed him the phone. He read the email. His face fell. The tea never made it to the counter. It shattered on the floor. Neither of them noticed. Because this wasn't just a royal snub. This was the final nail in a coffin Meghan had been pretending wasn't there. For years, she held on to the fantasy that maybe someday, things would soften. That maybe, when the dust settled, the family would remember that Archie and Lily weren't pawns. They were babies. Innocent. Half royal. Half American. Fully deserving. But now, that fantasy was gone. The meltdown began later that night. After the kids were asleep. After the staff had left. After the cameras, the advisors, the posture, all faded. It was just Meghan, in her study, alone. And the tears came like a flood. Not quiet tears. Not controlled. Ugly, broken sobs. She wasn't crying for herself. She was crying for them. For Archie, who asked about Grandpa Charles once and never again. For Lilibet, who would grow up never having walked the gardens her mother once hoped she'd play in. For every royal privilege that had been twisted into punishment. Meghan had survived bullying. She'd survived press attacks. She'd survived public hatred, private grief, and institutional coldness. But this was betrayal on a cellular level. Because when a family says, you're not welcome, that's pain. But when they say, your children aren't welcome, that's war. And Meghan knew one thing. The press would spin this. They'd say she was overreacting. That she and Harry were rich, privileged, ungrateful. They'd say this wasn't about race. That Charles was just being frugal, or policy-driven, or cautious. But Meghan saw through it all. She saw the same cold calculations that had followed her since day one. The same whispers that said, she doesn't belong. The same smirks that said, she's lucky to be here at all. Well now, she wasn't trying to belong. She was about to speak, and the world would listen. That's when she started drafting the statement. Not a press release. Not a tweet. Something bigger. Something devastating. Something she never wanted to write, but always knew she might have to. The working title? Dear Britain. And the opening line? What do you call a family that cuts off its own? Yeah, she wasn't playing. The document wasn't angry. It was lethal. Polished. Precise. Personal. A blend of memoir and manifesto. She outlined the timeline, from the initial request, to the rejection, to the silence. She quoted the email. She referenced the contrast, how William and Kate's children were already enrolled in top-tier institutions with full support. She didn't attack Charles directly, but she didn't need to. The facts did it for her. She framed the rejection not as a financial issue, but as a moral one. As a test, the monarchy failed. She ended the first draft with a line that sent chills through the one person she showed it to. Harry. The line read, if you won't build a future for my children, I will. But history will never forget that when the crown had a choice, it chose cruelty. Harry read the draft in silence. He didn't argue, didn't push back, but he said one thing. Once this goes out, there's no coming back. Meghan looked at him and replied, there's nothing left to come back to. Boom. That was the moment the line was crossed. The gloves were off, and Meghan was preparing for battle, not with bitterness, but with truth. Because when the palace turned Archie and Lilibet into symbols of exile, Meghan flipped the script. They would now be symbols of resistance, of independence, of what happens when you reject an institution and rise anyway. But here's the twist. She never released the statement. Not yet. Because just as she prepared to move forward, something unexpected happened. A phone call. From a name she didn't expect. Not from Harry's side. Not even from California. It came from across the Atlantic. And it wasn't hostile. It wasn't cold. It was soft, shocking, and deeply personal. 3 words. Can we talk? Who said it? And why? That's where the real story takes a turn. Because as Meghan stared at the name on her screen, she realized this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about something deeper. And the person calling her might be the one wild card the monarchy never accounted for. The name on Meghan's screen? Camilla. Not Charles. Not William. Not even a palace aide running interference. No, it was Queen Camilla herself. And Meghan just stared. Because that wasn't supposed to happen. Ever. Not after the icy glares. Not after the headlines. Not after the rumored, "You get what you give" comment Camilla reportedly muttered after the Oprah interview aired. But there it was. Her name. Her number. Her request. Can we talk? No explanation. No context. Just a message. And Meghan? She didn't answer. Not right away. Instead, she walked into Harry's office, handed him the phone, and whispered, "Your stepmother wants to talk to me." Harry looked at the screen. Blink. Silence. He didn't say a word, but his face said everything. This is a trap. It took another hour before Meghan responded. One line. "If this is sincere, you'll speak to Harry first." What came next changed everything. Because within 5 minutes, Harry's phone lit up. Private number. Royal code. And just like that, the prince picked up a line he hadn't answered in months. He hadn't spoken to his father or his stepmother since the coronation. A brief nod. An awkward handshake. No words. But now, Camilla was on the line. And she wasn't angry. She was measured. Soft-spoken. Careful. "This has gone too far," she said. "No one wanted this. Least of all Charles." Harry said nothing. Camilla pressed on. "You know what you asked wasn't unreasonable. But the timing, the tension, it made everyone reactive." Everyone? Harry thought. No. It made Charles cold. It made William hostile. It made Camilla silent. Until now. And then she said it. The sentence that cracked the call wide open. "He's scared of you, Harry. Scared of what you'll do next." Boom. Not out of anger. Out of fear. Fear of another book. Fear of another documentary. Fear of losing control of the narrative again. Harry almost dropped the phone. Not because it was shocking, but because it was the first time someone inside the palace had admitted it. They weren't just punishing him. They were terrified of him. He finally responded. "Then why cut off my kids?" Camilla didn't answer right away. The silence dragged. Then came the whisper. "Because if he gives in, he loses." There it was. The truth. This wasn't about Archie or Lilibet. It wasn't about school funding. It wasn't even about protocol. It was about power. If Charles said yes, he validated Harry. If he said no, he punished the Sussexes publicly. Either way, the family fractured. But in Charles's eyes, only one option preserved the throne. Control. And so he chose the crown. Over the children. Over the family. Over Harry. The call ended awkwardly. No resolution. No promises. Just an opening. But it left Harry shaken. He wasn't angry. He was defeated. Because even Camilla, the woman who spent years being the outsider, wasn't fighting for them. She was smoothing things over. Protecting Charles. And it hit him. There's no one left inside. No ally. No advocate. Just closed doors. So he did something unexpected. He went upstairs. Sat at the kitchen counter. And called Charles. Direct. No aid. No email. No buffer. And the phone rang. Once. Twice. Then it connected. And Charles didn't sound surprised. "Hello, Harry." No warmth. No venom. Just neutral. Like a man who'd already written off the conversation. Harry got straight to the point. "I want to talk about your response." A pause. Then Charles sighed. Not annoyed. Not apologetic. Just tired. "What is there to talk about?" Harry blinked. Was this really his father? This man who held his hand after Diana's death, who walked beside him through war, weddings, and world tours, now sounded like a CEO. Like this was just another business negotiation. Harry pressed. "They're your grandchildren." Another pause. Then, the line that cracked Harry wide open. "They're your responsibility now." Click. End of call. That was the moment Harry broke. He didn't cry. Didn't scream. He just sat there, staring at the phone. Because in that one sentence, Charles didn't just cut him off. He erased himself. He didn't just say no. He said never again. And suddenly, the years of pain came flooding back. The spare label, the palace briefings against Meghan, the security cuts, the tabloid feeding, the hollow statements of support. All of it. A pattern, a warning, a wall. And Harry was on the other side. For good. That night, Harry didn't sleep. He walked the Montecito garden in circles, past the olive trees, past the chicken coop, back and forth, trying to calm the storm inside. And when the sun rose, he came to a decision. No more quiet diplomacy. No more back-channel letters. No more hoping. It was time to protect his children, not as a prince, but as a father. And that meant taking action. Publicly. Forcefully. Honestly. But before he could speak, someone else already had a plan. Meghan. And the plan she proposed wouldn't just shake the monarchy. It would split it wide open. Because Meghan was ready to reveal something the world had never seen before. And when she did, even Harry wasn't prepared for the fallout. He hadn't called Harry in over 5 months. Not for Archie's birthday. Not when Lilibet turned 2. Not after the Netflix bombshell. Not even when Spare shattered records and left the monarchy scrambling. But now, suddenly, William was on the line. And it wasn't to catch up. It was to warn him. Before you make a mistake you can't take back, William allegedly began, his voice clipped, sharp, and, most surprisingly, calm. Harry didn't reply at first. Not out of silence. Out of disbelief. Because William didn't call when their mother's statue was unveiled. He didn't reach out when Harry revealed suicidal thoughts, racist concerns, or the devastating loss of security. He ghosted. Repeatedly. Deliberately. But now that Harry was poised to speak out, really speak out, suddenly, his brother had an opinion? Now he wanted to mediate? Or was it something else entirely? Let's be clear. This wasn't a brotherly intervention. This was a royal one. Because while Charles was busy guarding the crown, William was guarding something more dangerous. The future. His future. And Harry, with Meghan at his side and a global platform at his fingertips, was a threat. Not just to the firm, but to the image William had spent years crafting. The image of the perfect heir. Stable. Dutiful. Untouched by scandal. But if Harry pulled back the curtain again? If Meghan went public with that letter, the memo, the titles, the betrayal? Then William's role as future king wouldn't just be uncomfortable. It would be indefensible. So he picked up the phone, not to fix things, but to contain them. The call lasted 14 minutes. Long enough to get tense. Too short to resolve anything. Sources say William opened with diplomacy. Calm, direct, even rehearsed. He acknowledged the situation was complex, that feelings had been hurt on both sides. But then came the turn, the line that dropped all pretense. If you go public with this, you'll burn every bridge left. It wasn't a threat. It was a dare. Harry laughed. What bridges, he reportedly shot back. Because from his side, there weren't any. No communication. No compassion. No cooperation. Just silence. And now that he had finally found a way to speak for his children, his brother wanted him to shut it down? Absolutely not. But William wasn't done. He pivoted. Hard. You're letting her drive this again. The word stung. Because there it was. The unspoken accusation at the root of every royal briefing, every tabloid whisper, every frosty Windsor glare. That Harry was just a passenger in Meghan's warpath. A puppet. A Prince-turned-California accessory. But Harry didn't flinch. He fired back. You think I'd risk everything for what? A headline? A Netflix deal? William didn't answer. He didn't have to. Because that's exactly what he thought. What they all thought. That Harry had traded duty for dopamine. Legacy for likes. But what none of them seemed to understand was that Harry didn't want the throne. He wanted freedom. For himself. For Meghan. And now, for Archie and Lilibet. And this request, for their education, was never about money. It was about acknowledgement. The palace didn't just say no. They said, you don't matter anymore. And William? He agreed. But here's where it gets complicated. Because this wasn't just personal. It was political. William is not king yet. But he's already acting like one. Insiders say he's taken over many of Charles's decision-making processes behind the scenes, managing image, directing messaging, vetting key statements. He is the monarchy's firewall. And to him, Harry's latest move wasn't a request. It was an attack. A threat to the very architecture of everything he's set to inherit. A stable royal line. Clean messaging. no dissenters, no distractions. And Harry is the loudest distraction of them all. So William did what he was trained to do. He used strategy. He tried to get ahead of the scandal before it broke. Not with empathy, but with control. "Don't do this, Harry." That's how he ended the call. Not "I miss you." Not "let's talk this through." Just control. And as the line went dead, Harry realized something gutting. His brother wasn't calling to heal anything. He was calling to save face, to save the brand, to keep the public from asking uncomfortable questions. Because if the full truth got out about what Charles said, about how Archie and Lilibet were formally excluded from royal financial consideration, then the whole modern monarchy narrative crumbles, and William would be left standing in the rubble. So the question becomes, was William acting out of loyalty or out of fear? Was he trying to preserve the institution or preserve himself? That's the tragedy of this story. There are no villains, only survivors. People clawing to maintain an image, a reputation, a crown. But what happens when survival means slicing off your own flesh? What happens when duty turns into betrayal? Because make no mistake, that's how Harry saw it. His own brother, the boy he once called his best mate, now standing shoulder to shoulder with the very institution that exiled his wife and ignored his children. And Meghan? She wasn't surprised. She never was. Not after how William allegedly refused to make eye contact at the Queen's funeral. Not after she was reportedly told to curtsy deeper for him than for Charles. Not after every press leak, every source, every silence. But this solidified it. William wasn't neutral. He was the palace. He was the future king. And future kings don't bend. They enforce. Even if that means crushing the people they once loved. So Harry made a decision. If William wanted to play king, then Harry would play the public. Not with petty vengeance. Not with scandal, but with truth. And the first step? Giving Meghan the green light. To finish her statement. To speak. To reveal everything. The letters. The calls. The rejection. The cold, calculated decision to erase 2 children from the royal narrative, just to make a point. But before Meghan could release it, something else happened. Something neither of them expected. Something that made headlines before they even hit send. A leak. From inside the palace. But not just any leak. Receipts. And when the press got hold of them, the story shifted again. Because this time, the palace wasn't just denying the kids. They were about to accuse Harry and Meghan of lying. The British press loves a villain. And the royal family? They've spent decades learning how to feed that hunger. Carefully, quietly, and with surgical precision. So when Meghan's statement was nearly finalized, when Harry was poised to drop the truth and expose the palace's rejection, suddenly, as if by magic, headlines erupted. Not from Montecito, but from London. And this time, the narrative wasn't King Charles denies Harry's request. It was palace sources. Harry and Meghan never asked for financial support. Boom. The counterattack had begun. It started in the Times. A single quote, buried 3 paragraphs down in a story about royal finances. According to HAZ, no formal request regarding Archie and Lilibet's education has ever been submitted. Just one sentence. But it detonated across media platforms like a landmine. The Daily Mail, the Telegraph, the Express, they all picked it up, twisted it, amplified it. Suddenly, Meghan and Harry weren't victims of royal cruelty. They were liars, manipulators, attention-seeking grifters, playing the victim card for headlines and sympathy. It wasn't just a PR war anymore. It was character assassination, dressed up in polite palace denial. And make no mistake, it was intentional. Because that one line, no formal request ever submitted, was worded just vaguely enough to create doubt. Was the request not formal enough? Was it verbal? Was it submitted through the wrong channel? The palace didn't clarify. They didn't have to. They'd sown the seed. And now the press would do the rest. By noon that day, British Twitter was ablaze. Hashtag Meghan Markle lies. Hashtag Harry the hypocrite. Hashtag no one asked Charles. Even neutral voices started weighing in. Journalists, politicians, royal historians. Some questioned the legitimacy of the Sussexes' claim. Others defended them, pointing out the palace's long history of weaponized leaks. But one thing was clear. The palace had struck first, and the Sussexes were now playing defense. Meghan was furious. Not because of the headlines, she was used to that, but because the palace was gaslighting the world in real time. She had the emails, the printed memo, the legal correspondence sent through their UK solicitor outlining the exact request. She had the receipts, and now she was ready to use them. That night, their spokesperson released a one-line statement to The Guardian. It read, "The Duke and Duchess of Sussex submitted a formal inquiry in September 2025 via legal counsel and can provide documentation upon request." Short, controlled, devastating. Because while the palace had relied on whispers and vague denials, Harry and Meghan were ready to bring the facts. And that scared the palace more than anything. Behind closed doors, courtiers scrambled. The "no formal request" line had backfired. Badly. Because now the media wanted the truth. What had the Sussexes actually submitted? Was there really a memo? Why would Harry risk this much backlash if he didn't have proof? And that's when the emails leaked. Not from Meghan, not from Harry, but from an anonymous source close to the legal team. Likely someone who'd had enough of the palace's spin. The email thread was time-stamped. Legal language. Formal tone. Specific references to educational contributions for the Duke's children as members of the royal line. It even included a CC to the King's private secretary. There it was. Proof. The request existed. It had been submitted. And the palace had lied. The internet exploded. Twitter retracted. Hashtags flipped. Now it was hashtag palace lied. Hashtag we stand with Harry and Meghan. Hashtag protect Archie and Lilibet. And the press? Divided. Some doubled down, accusing the Sussexes of strategically leaking for attention. Others backpedaled, cautiously acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, the palace had been less than honest. But for Harry and Meghan, it wasn't a victory. It was validation, bitter and overdue. Because this wasn't the first time the royal family tried to gaslight them. It had happened after Oprah, after the miscarriage, after Spare, and every time, it followed the same pattern. Denial, discredit, destroy. Only now? It wasn't working, because the world had changed. People had watched the documentaries, read the memoirs, heard the recordings. They'd seen the receipts, and the crown was starting to crack. Back inside the palace, a war room formed. Not a literal one, but close. Charles, Camilla, William, and their closest aides gathered to plan a response. Not to the press, but to Harry and Meghan's next move. Because the PR war wasn't over. It was escalating, and someone, reportedly William himself, suggested the nuclear option. Release the trust fund records. What does that mean? Let's break it down. Every royal child, from George to Charlotte to Louis, has certain financial arrangements made for them. Private trusts, educational allowances, stipends. Most of these are funded through a mix of the sovereign grant, personal royal income, and family investments. And Archie and Lilibet, according to palace insiders, were quietly excluded from those arrangements in 2020. Why? Because Harry and Meghan had stepped back. Because they were no longer working royals. Because they were a liability. Now, William wanted that information accidentally leaked, to show the public that it wasn't personal. That Archie and Lilibet had simply fallen outside the eligibility criteria. But others, including Camilla, allegedly warned against it. "You'll look like you're punishing children," she reportedly said. Still, the strategy was clear. Turn public sympathy against the Sussexes. Frame them as greedy, manipulative, calculating. Paint the request as opportunistic, not parental. And shift the conversation from, "Why did you deny them?" to, "Why are they asking it all?" But Harry wasn't going to let that happen. He called a meeting of his own, not with lawyers, not with PR firms, but with education leaders. Because if the palace wanted to say no, then Harry would go bigger. He and Meghan began planning something bold. An international education initiative, not just for their kids, but for children of fallen veterans, displaced families, and underserved communities. A project that would center Archie and Lilibet as the inspiration. A direct response to royal rejection, but with global impact, not bitterness, vision. And just as that plan took shape, Meghan's original statement, the one she drafted weeks ago, resurfaced, but not as a press release, as a keynote speech. At an upcoming global summit on legacy, identity, and education, set in New York City, set to air live. And the title? Inheritance Without Inclusion, Why our children deserve better. A not-so-subtle dig. And the palace? Freaked. Because this wasn't just a message to Charles or William. This was a message to the world. Harry and Meghan weren't asking anymore. They were building. And the royal family had just handed them the emotional leverage they needed to do it. But just as the summit drew closer, as the world waited to hear Meghan finally speak on what happened behind palace walls, someone inside the monarchy, someone unexpected, picked up the phone and made a call that would change the trajectory of everything. A voice Harry hadn't heard in years, someone he once trusted, and what they said would force him to choose between truth and peace. It came out of nowhere, an unknown number, a name Harry hadn't seen flash across his screen in over a decade. Patrick Jeffson, Princess Diana's former private secretary, the man who once guarded her appointments, filtered her press calls, and, at her lowest, helped protect her from the institution she feared. He had gone quiet after her death, stepped away from the circus, faded into discreet consultancy roles and historical commentaries. But now, he was calling, and when Harry answered, he got straight to the point. "There's something of your mother's you need to see." Harry froze, because when Patrick Jeffson called, it wasn't for gossip. It was for war. They arranged to meet in London. Quietly. No press. No escort. Just two men, one shared legacy, and a piece of paper that hadn't seen the light of day in nearly 30 years. Jeffson slid the envelope across the table. Cream-colored. Familiar handwriting. Harry's throat tightened before he even opened it. The moment his fingers touched the seal, he knew. It was real. His mother's voice, written years before her death. But the contents shook him. The letter was dated April 1995, just months before Diana's infamous Panorama interview. It wasn't a will. It wasn't instructions. It was a warning, addressed simply to my boys, but with references to the family, future heirs, and second sons. She wrote of fears, of inheritance politics, of how the system was built to reward proximity to the crown and punish deviation. And then, a specific paragraph, underlined twice. "If either of my sons should ever find themselves raising children outside the direct line, I pray they are not made to feel lesser. I fear the institution will forget them, as it once forgot me, and it will be the grandchildren who pay the price." Harry's eyes blurred. He read it again, and again, each word cutting like glass. His mother saw it coming. All of it. Even then, before social media, before Meghan, before Montecito. She saw the mechanism. How it isolates, discards, sanitizes history until only the heir remains. She feared it would come for her sons. And it had. Jeffson watched in silence. Then he spoke. "She asked me to destroy that letter. I never could. I hoped it would never be necessary." Harry asked the obvious question. "Why now?" Jeffson leaned in. "Because what they're doing to your children is what they did to her. And you need to decide if you're going to stop it or let it happen again." Boom. There it was. Legacy. Cycle. Bloodline. Repetition. This wasn't just a letter from the past. It was a bridge between Diana's suffering and Lilibet's future. And Harry was at the crossroads. He flew back to Montecito the next morning. Quiet. Shaken. Resolved. Because he knew what came next. He had the receipts. He had the legal documentation. He had the moral high ground. But now, he had something more powerful than all of it. Diana's voice. Proof that the rejection of his children wasn't new. It was designed. That the palace, from generation to generation, had a blueprint. Exalt the heir. Marginalize the spare. Erase anything that threatens the myth. But this time, the spare had a platform, and he was going to use it. Harry showed the letter to Meghan that evening. She read it once, then sat in silence for nearly 5 minutes. When she finally looked up, her eyes were glassy, but her voice was steel. "You're your mother's son, and I'm not going to let them do to you what they did to her." That's when the decision was made. The summit wasn't going to be a soft pitch. It wasn't going to be a charitable veil for their truth. It was going to be a full-blown revelation, one that would center Diana's fears and draw a direct line to what Charles and William were now doing. And here's where it gets wild. Because somehow, before the summit even happened, someone in the palace caught wind of the Diana letter. How? Leaks. Whispers. Family shadows. Maybe it was Jeffson himself. Maybe it was someone on Harry's flight. But the fear in Buckingham Palace was palpable. Because if Diana's letter went public, If her own handwritten fears about future royal grandchildren being excluded surfaced, Charles's rejection of Archie and Lilibet wouldn't just look cold. It would look diabolical, and William's silence would become complicity. So what did they do? Exactly what Diana predicted. They tried to erase it. Behind the scenes, the palace allegedly contacted legal teams, questioning the letter's authenticity, suggesting it may have been unauthorized, incomplete, or misinterpreted. Camilla, reportedly,